Good morning, everyone. We are so glad you're here today. We are going to give our participants just a few more minutes here to join, and then we'll go ahead and get started. If you have any technical difficulties, our staff will do our best to assist. You can mention any of those difficulties in the chat. And again, welcome, and we'll get started in just a minute here. All right, well, I believe that everyone is here in attendance. So good morning, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Darling. I am the manager of membership and annual giving here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And we are so excited to give you a special edition of our member-only curator conversation that will discuss our newest special exhibition, Violins of Hope. And I won't go into a whole lot of detail on that because you're going to get a deep dive into the program with Andrew Talkov, who is our Senior Director of Curatorial Affairs, and a very special guest, Avshi Weinstein, who is the son of the Violins of Hope founder. And he has been instrumental, and I did intend that pun, in bringing the exhibition here to Richmond, Virginia. We will have opportunities for questions and answers throughout the program. So please feel free to, when the question comes to you, add it to the chat or to the Q&A feature, and we will pepper those in throughout the discussion between Andy and Avshi. And before I hand it over to Andy, I would be remiss if I didn't thank you all so very much for your continued support of the museum as members. We certainly could not do what we do without your support. So thank you again. And without further ado, I will hand it off to Andy.
Good morning, everyone. Well, it's really nice to be able to talk about one of our current exhibitions, Violins of Hope, today. I came into the museum, as I do every morning, and stood for a few moments in the gallery, which I hope you can see here on your screen, where we're displaying 7 violins from the really remarkable Violins of Hope collection. And, you know, as a museum curator, you know, projects like this start many years oftentimes before the public ever gets to see them. And so we actually started working with the Virginia Holocaust Museum on bringing Violins of Hope to Richmond in 2018. And of course, that project was extended a little unexpectedly by a global pandemic, unfortunately, but we're glad that it's here now with us in 2021. And as with every exhibit project, you know, the team here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture spends countless hours, you know, doing research and writing exhibit copy and editing exhibit copy and gathering images and reviewing designs, and most importantly, working with the objects in our collections and other collections in order to produce the exhibit. And you do that so much that by the time the exhibit opens to the public, you have a really good sense, like you can feel it in your mind what the exhibit is going to be like before it even opens. But I have to say that my experience with Violins of Hope was remarkably different. We had done all of that work. The cases were in place. The graphics were up, but when the violins arrived for the first time we saw them was like 2 days before the exhibit actually opened. We'd seen pictures of them. And I have to say that when I walked into the gallery and saw them for the first time, these violins are part of a group of more than 60 painstakingly restored violins, violas, cellos that were owned by Jewish people before and during World War II. And the restoration has been done by violin maker Amnon Weinstein and his son Avshi, who's with us today, as a tribute to the 6 million Jewish people who were murdered during the Holocaust. And I was really I was unexpectedly blown away. I knew the exhibit would be powerful. But, in addition to the beauty of each instrument, I almost felt like I could feel the people who once held these instruments. And even if I was quiet, like could imagine the sound that they made. And each one of these violins has a uniqueness, just like the people who owned them. But there's also, as you can see in this image, kind of like a simple uniformity to them all as well. And as I was sort of taking in the beauty of these objects, I was then sort of immediately shocked, into thinking about the events that actually brought these instruments together. And it was really an experience that I rarely have. It was very surprising to me. And I think that those of you who have been here maybe have had a similar experience, and if you haven't been to see them, I really hope you will. And I think what's really wonderful is how involved Avshi has been with us here in Richmond. I know he's done many programs around town, and I'm so glad that Avshi, who's a third-generation violin maker, is with us today from Turkey, and is going to be able to talk with us a little bit about the Violins of Hope project, and then about some of the violins that you can see in this, in this image. So welcome, Avshi.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
Well, it's really nice. It's really nice to have you here. So I think first and foremost, it would be helpful to everyone to talk a little bit about the origin of Violins of Hope and how this sort of remarkable project started.
So it didn't really start, but my grandfather, after the war finished, he was already in Israel. He immigrated in 1938 with my grandmother. And when the war finished and people learned and heard about what the Nazis did during the war, there was a very strong ban in Israel on everything German. And many musicians who were in Israel before the war, coming from Germany and Austria, some of them the founding members of the Palestine Orchestra, which is today the Israeli Philharmonic, they sold their German-made instruments to my grandfather, even though he knew that he basically lost all his family. And my grandmother's family, he didn't want to see those instruments being destroyed or lost. So he bought what he could. Now, because nobody wanted to buy anything German, he couldn't sell them. And they basically stayed in our workshop for many, many years until in 1991, my father had an apprentice coming from Dresden, which was, as you can probably know, it was Eastern Germany until 1989. And in Eastern Germany, like in all over the Soviet Union, Jewish Holocaust didn't exist. They wouldn't talk about it, wouldn't mention it. And when this person, his name is Daniel Schmidt, when he came to Israel in the 1990s, he met lots of survivors, some of the founding members of the orchestras. And he saw this collection that my father had. In Tel Aviv in the 1940s, end of the 30s, it was a bit bigger, probably the size of the museum, not much more. And having such great instruments in such a small place. He was very surprised, and when he heard from my father on how they traveled and with whom they came, he asked my father to come to Germany and to give a lecture to the German Violin and Bow Making Association about how those instruments came to Israel. And after that lecture, my father asked on radio if people knew about stories of musicians who survived or died during the war, and maybe by chance, they even have their instruments. And we started getting slowly, more and more instruments with a direct connection with stories of survivors. Like you can see the first violin on the right on this photo is the violin from Dachau that we will talk about later.
Mm.
And other instruments of, I think all the instruments you have in the museum are of survivors. Some of the instruments that we have, unfortunately, the musician passed away, but many of them are of survivors. And we are still getting and hearing about more and more stories all the time.
So I'm going to go to the next slide here really quickly. So here's a picture of your father in his shop, right?
Yes. This is the first workshop we had. This is actually the second. The very first one was in a different street. And then later on, my grandparents, they moved to basically to the apartment above the workshop here. And later on, we bought the basement in the next building, which is today the actual workshop. As you can see, this is rather a museum slash storage slash office. But this was the workshop where my grandfather worked. He worked basically, if we think about where the photographer stands, behind his back. This was the place that he worked. And if you see the table on the right hand of the photo, this was the table that my grandmother was sitting every day and talking to customers and working.
Wow. So I think that, so your grandfather was, and we'll talk about his story a little bit as we get on, but you know, so your grandfather was a violin maker and your
restorer. My grandfather,
restorer.
My grandfather, as far as we know, he never made a violin. He was doing small restoration and maintenance. My father, he studied with my grandfather a bit, and later on he moved to Cremona and he studied in a violin making school there, and he was trained as a violin maker and a restorer.
And then you are also a violin maker, right? And restorer.
Yes. Yeah.
So this sort of begs the question, was how did you decide that that's the path that you wanted to take in your life? Was there an expectation that you would do this?
I guess you can say there was an expectation. I mean, when I was a bit older, I would go with my father on vacations. I would go to the workshop and play a little bit with wood and stuff. And if he had to go to his accountant or to other places, I would come to him. And I remember that one of the times he said, "So is this going to be the next generation?" And my father used to say, "Well, he has no choice." I mean, of course, I had a choice, but I enjoy working with wood. Every violin is different. Not necessarily only the instruments of the collection, but every violin in general is different. Even if you make a violin, every piece of wood you'll work with is different. It's in different acoustic, different age, different density, different whatever. And I enjoy it. I mean,
yeah. So each one is even, from your perspective, each one is even more unique than someone like me would even begin to really understand just by looking at it.
Let's say it this way. When I started working with my father seriously and working on instruments, we used to get a violin to the workshop and he would say, "Okay, this is a German or this is French and this was made by this was made by that." And I would say, "Yeah, right." And after you see 100 violins, you understand a bit better. And when you see 1,000, you get much better of it. And when you see more than that, you can become an expert. I'll never be an expert. My father is an expert in few very specific fields in violin making. Identity, yeah, if you want to say which violin is which. There are experts in our profession that, let's say if I have a violin from a certain period, from a certain place, I would know whom to go to get the best answer of who might have made it. But there isn't one person who is an expert on all violin makers all over all the periods. Each one has his own very specific timing, and these are people who've seen simply so many instruments for so many years, and they have very special kind of photographic memory.
Yeah.
But in order to become such an expert, you need to sit in a place that you simply see many, many instruments.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, Tel Aviv or Turkey, that's not the place. Paris, London, these are the places. Germany, some places.
Right. Right. Well, so how come you decided to set up shop in Turkey?
My wife is Turkish, and
Good reason.
so yeah, I mean, this is how it happened.
Well, so I think it's interesting that I have to say that in reading about the collection, in listening to other people talk about the collection, there always seems to be like a genesis moment. And I think what's interesting is you're saying that it actually grew a lot more organically than that. But at some point, someone put a name to it, Violins of Hope. Where did that come from?
From what I recall, this comes from a good friend of ours whose friend is French in origin. We did a big concert in Tel Aviv in Jerusalem in 2008. And he was the producer. It was outside the walls of Jerusalem. And because he was very much trying to get French people to come, he gave it the name in French. It says Violon d'Espoir, Violins of Hope. And this is where it comes from, as far as I remember. I mean, because before that, I don't remember calling it Violins of Hope.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that certainly it's a remarkably fitting title, and I think it resonates with a lot of people, which sort of leads me, you know, I mean, as a museum curator, we think about objects and the power of objects to tell stories. And I was wondering what you think it is about the history of the violin that makes it such a powerful tool to be able to talk to people and educate people about the Holocaust.
Because you can listen to them. If I take off the glass from every single violin that you have on display, someone can play on it and you can hear the sound. And you can probably hear a little bit of the sound that the last person who played it for a long time left on that violin, his own, let's say, mark. I'll give you an example. Yeah, it's a bit kind of a long story, but we have a very good friend who had a fantastic Stradivari from 1693, if I remember the exact year. And in those times, Stradivari was still working very much like his teacher, Amati. And in one of the masterclass that we've been, there was a girl that her father bought her an Amati from 1687, 6 years apart. Very similar instruments. The guy who owned the Stradivari, he had it by then probably around 10 years, give or take. And we did a small work on the Amati, and we asked two people to play on those instruments. Same place, same bow, same acoustics. When one of the people played on them, it was very clear. This is violin number one, violin number two. No question about. When the owner of the Stradivari played, it was very clear. This is number one, this is number two. I'm not saying which one was better, yeah? It was very clear it's two completely different instruments. And when another person, 2 minutes later, in the same place, the same bow, played on those two violins, it was very hard to say which one is which. the guy who played on the Stradivari for 10 years already, he left his mark, his acoustics, his whatever, already into the violin. And it was very clear that when he played the two instruments, well, this is violin A and this is violin B. And when someone else played both of them, it was like, there is something there, but it wasn't that clear. It wasn't black and white. It was very, very, very gray.
Yeah.
So when we play an instrument, when someone plays an instrument for a long time, they leave their mark. The way they hold the violin, the way they play, the weight, their whatever it is, it leaves a mark.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, that's so true of a lot of objects that you see in a museum. You know, if you take the time to really look at it, you can see the wear that a person has put on it. In this case, I think it's beautiful that you say that not only is it the physical mark that people leave, but there's also a mark that comes from their playing, right? That when they play the instrument,
yeah.
that there's something very unique about that. I'll say that, you know, you said, you know, if you take the other interesting thing about this collection is that every one of these instruments, when handled by museum people, is handled with, you know, incredible amounts of care and respect, and with gloves, and then we put a plastic bonnet on it to protect it, you know, from people touching it. And so it's really been wonderful. There have been a number of community concerts with members of the Richmond Symphony, and I know this happens in other cities too. It's really wonderful to see them handled, you know, by people who are expert in playing them as well, you know, throughout. But in our gallery, I also feel like there's kind of a silent witness, you know, aspect to these, that these violins witnessed some of the most horrible things that have happened in human history. And they sort of stand as a testimonial to that too, right? They're just simple existence, right? For the people who no longer are able to be with us.
I mean, of course, because in the end, what they've seen, what they've been through, we don't really understand. I mean, even if you think that, yeah, I read so many books and seen movies, it's not like actually being there. Although they are not a video camera or a recording machine that can give you the sounds and the smells and the pictures from the place, they give us the sound from that time. And this is something which sound and eyes are two very different senses. And what we get out of both is, let's say, like a complete picture, maybe I would say, I don't know.
Yeah,
but
no,
it's another way of feeling something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the concerts have been very powerful. So one of the things, well, and I guess, you know, the violin was an important part of Jewish culture, you know, certainly before the Holocaust. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yes, I mean, violins were in existence on almost every Jewish family house. It was relatively very cheap to buy. People could learn how to play them easy, in a way, self-taught. The vast majority of the musicians were self-taught. And it was a way to bring some music into life, you know, for the good days, for holidays, for whatever. And violins, like I said, it was very accessible, very cheap. Of course, you could buy already then Stradivarius, but the vast majority didn't have money to buy Stradivarius. Like today, nobody,
Right.
Not that many people can afford a $15 million violin. But when it's few dollars, I mean, it's something accessible.
Yeah.
There was a very, very widespread tradition of klezmer music in Eastern Europe, mainly. But the klezmer musicians, unfortunately, because the vast majority of them were self-taught, they didn't know how to read and write music, and they couldn't play in the orchestras in the camps and ghettos. And many, many of them were killed, and this tradition basically never, ever revived after the war. It was basically extinct, especially in Eastern Europe.
Klezmer, for our viewers who aren't familiar with klezmer music, it's essentially the folk music, right? Of
Jewish folk
Eastern
music,
European
yes.
Jewish people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so why don't we talk a little bit about some of the violins in the collection? And I think that it's most fitting. Here's another really intense picture of your father working on a violin.
Yeah, and don't worry about all the mess and stuff. This is how it really is. I mean.
And then I think that the first violin has an important family connection to you.
Yeah, this is the violin that my grandfather basically played every single day. He finished the conservatory on violin in Vilna. This is a photo with my grandmother. She was a pianist. They used to play sometimes for the silent movies. And before they immigrated to Israel, to Palestine in 1938, he studied a little bit of violin maintenance in Poland and Vilna. And when he arrived to Israel, he was picking up oranges in the orange plantations, and later on he opened our first workshop in 1939.
So is the story that I've heard true about how he became interested in playing the violin?
Well, this is the story that he says. I mean, all his family, except he had 11 brothers and sisters. Only one of his brothers survived. My grandmother was one of 7 or 8, and none of her family survived. So I cannot really tell you if that story is true or not, but what my father was told, he never talked to us about it, the grandkids, yeah. When he was growing up in the small village, one day to one of the weddings, there was a group of klezmer coming. Sometimes these weddings would be 2-3 days long. And when he heard the violin sound, he fell in love with the sound of the violin, and he couldn't move anywhere. He started running after the klezmers when they left the city, and then they caught him, brought him back to the city, to his mom, my grandmother, and after some, let's say, punishment that today is not so much probably legal, he basically got his first violin and started learning violin. Yeah,
amazing. And so did you have the opportunity did your grandfather or grandmother, did you know them?
I met both of them, yes. I met my grandparents. My grandfather, he passed away in 1986. I remember a little bit about him, but not that much. My grandmother passed away years later, more than 20 years later. So when I started working with my father, like I said, she lived in the first floor. So every day in the morning I would come up, talk to her, sit with her during lunch, whatever. Of course, yeah, I knew my grandmother very well. But they never talked about their families. Yeah. Not to us as grandkids, not to my father, not to my late aunt, not to anyone. I can show you the boxes where we have letters from their family members begging them to try and get them certificates to come to Israel, but we don't know more than that.
Huh. Well, that certainly must have been difficult for them to watch what was happening or hear what was happening from afar too.
We don't know how much they knew in real time, Yeah, but very soon after the war, my father met a friend of his who was a doctor, and he told my grandfather, my grandfather met him, so, sorry, and he told my grandfather what happened to all his family. So very soon after the war ended, they already knew that basically they lost everybody.
Yeah, it's awful. Well, it's wonderful that this violin survives, and is part of the collection. This isn't your grandfather did some restoration. Another violin in the collection was owned by Jacob Hackert.
No, it was made by
Jacob.
Yeah, Jacob Hackert was one of probably only 5 Jewish violin makers working in Europe in the time. This is actually the very first violin that he ever made in the violin making school in Mircourt in France. He studied there violin making, and later on he did his apprentice in Germany, and then moved back to his home country, to the Netherlands, and opened up a workshop there, and also a very successful string factory. So this is a photo of in his workshop in where was it? I'll remember it later. It's in the Netherlands. And he, unfortunately, he tried to run away, but he was caught and sent to Auschwitz. Sorry, and he was killed in Auschwitz in 20 of May 1944. His ex-wife, he was divorced, and kids, they somehow managed to run all the way to Switzerland and survived, and we got it from his grandkids, basically.
So is this, would you say that this is a violin that came to the collection later or earlier?
Yes. No, this came later. This was in 2000 something. Yeah.
Let's see. So you mentioned earlier this violin, the
Dachau
violin.
Yeah. So what we know, and I mean, we have to remember one thing. Many of those people, either they never said one word about what happened to them, or things got mixed up or whatever. This violin was owned by Avraham Marchinsky, that him and his brother, they survived Dachau. And after the war, there were Jewish people who were living with some German families until they could find themselves a new place to stay, or basically a new country. And he gave it to the German family that they stayed with before they left the United States. And this is, from what they remember, is the violin that he played in the Dachau concentration camp. And they gave it, the family that got it gave it to a German violin maker in Germany, and he gave it to us, to the collection. This is what we know. I mean, by the time we got this violin, there was later on a book written on this violin in German. As far as I know, Avraham Marchinsky died already, and they couldn't really say, yeah, this was the violin that he played or not. But what the family said, the family who got the violin, they said this was the violin that he played in Dachau, in the camp, and this is the violin that survived with him.
So, so under what circumstances were the violins played in the camps?
So the Nazis loved music. They used music in many ways, and usually in the camps, what would happen is you'll have an orchestra in every single camp. Sometimes the camp commanders, they had like a competition, so-called, between the camps, which orchestra plays which songs and which things, and they would use it to march people out to work, march them back in, or just they wanted to hear this or that specific music, so the orchestra had to play it. And in many times also all the camp had to stay outside in rain and snow and for hours when the Nazis wanted to hear this or that music. This was in a way a torture, because it would be cold, it would be rainy or snowy, or it could be snowing and you're not allowed to move. You're not allowed to sit. And if
Right.
you move or you sit, they either beat you or kill you. So this was, for many of those prisoners, this would be a torture.
And you had said that people who were skilled musicians who knew how to read music might have been included in those orchestras.
Yes, I mean, there were lots of musicians from all over Europe, not only Jews, and there were Polish, and whoever was in the camp and was lucky enough to be able to play an instrument. They had an advantage because they would be the last one to go to work, the first one to come back from work, because the Nazis needed them as an orchestra. They would give them a bit of better conditions, maybe a bit better food, and they survived. Did they talk about it later? Probably most of them didn't.
Yeah, but for some, their ability to play this instrument, these instruments, was the way that they were able to survive.
They managed to survive. Yeah.
Here's an image of does he pronounce his name Gualterio?
I'm not so sure.
Gualtiero?
My father knows Italian. I don't. My Italian is very, very poor. Yeah, that's his violin, Morpurgo. He played it basically every single day, and he was detained in few camps, managed to run away, and he survived. And later on, when they started the illegal immigrants coming to Israel, and he was working on some boats in Italy, preparing them basically to the illegal voyage to Israel, to Palestine before Israel was founded. And he got a medal for that. And I met his wife 2 years ago now, actually, in Italy, and his daughters, they are still alive. His wife is 93 or 94, maybe even 95 by now, actually.
Oh, wow.
Still alive. And this was the violin that he played in some of the working camps and other places that he's been, yes.
And so one of the interesting stories you talked about is the fact that he was involved in helping Jewish people migrate to Palestine.
Yeah, illegally.
Illegally.
Yeah. Until 1947, 1948, before Israel was founded, the British didn't allow people to come to Israel, Jewish people. So many survivors from Europe before and after the war, of course, during the war it was impossible, but before and after they went on illegal immigrant boats going from Europe to Israel. Many of them were caught, sometimes sent to other places, sometimes sent to prisons. But some managed to smuggle into Palestine, into Israel, basically. And those boats, they were usually the oldest one you could find in very poor condition, and they need to go through extensive work to accommodate. Let's say if the boat was good for 100, they would put 300 or 400 or 500 people.
Right.
So they had to be modified by people that you would hope know what they are doing, so they won't drown on the way. And Morpurgo, he knew what he was doing. He was he was an engineer, so he was helping with that in Italy.
And there's a violin, another violin in the collection that's actually here at the museum. I don't have an image of it, but the Erich Weininger.
Erich Weininger, yes.
So he actually also tried to emigrate to Palestine during the
war.
So
he came, he was born and raised in Vienna. And in 1938, after the Nazis took over, he was arrested. And his sister, I think she was married to a Quaker. And somehow she managed to get him released. And he ran away from Europe, and he went on one of those boats going from Romania. This was before Romania was in the war. It took them, I think, 3 months to get to Israel, rather than about 10 days normal journey. And when they arrived, his boat was immediately caught by the British, and he was sent to Mauritius, to a prison in Mauritius,
Mhm.
where he spent all his war, most of the war basically. And he had his violin with him all the time. They had a small orchestra there. Also, he was in Dachau and Buchenwald. He also had his violin there. And later on, when the war ended, the British expelled thousands of Jewish people during the war, like Erich Wieninger and many others, to Mauritius, to Cyprus, to other places. And when the war ended, the American President Truman, he basically forced the British government to take all these Jewish people back into Israel and let them live in Israel. So this is how Erich Wieninger managed to arrive to Israel, where he lived. Yeah.
Well, so I'm looking at the clock and I want to make sure that we have time for some questions. I'm going to tease up the Bielski violin, which is also on display here. Now, the identity of the person who owned this violin is unknown
No. All the klezmer violins, those that you can see, like this one with Stars of David, we don't really know their history, unfortunately. So we rather dedicate them to a story or to a person, like this violin, which is dedicated to the Bielski partisans, which was the group where my grandfather, my grandmother, and my uncles, they founded it. My grandfather founded it basically, and later on all of the other brothers and family members joined. And this was the biggest partisan camp during the war. They saved over 1,230 Jewish people. And that's the story behind it. And the photo that you see here is a group of some people from the fighting unit of the Bielski partisan in one of the last forests that they've been to.
So this is I'll do like a cross promotion now with another program that you helped us do, because the story of the Bielski partisans was the subject of the movie Defiance.
Yes.
And so you did one of our movie myth-busting programs about that film and talked about your family's participation in that and the truth versus fiction of that film. So I'll direct all of our members who are interested in learning more about that. They can catch that program. So one thing I'll say as we're waiting for questions to come in is that, as you said, playing the instruments is an important part of the Violins of Hope project. And the exhibit, Violins of Hope, will close here on October 24th. And that evening at 5:30, we'll be hosting here at the museum a concert, a chamber music concert, featuring musicians from the Richmond Symphony. It'll be at 5:30. Tickets for our members are $10, and they can be purchased on our website. And so while we're waiting for people's questions, I am interested in just your thoughts about what you hope people will walk away with, what thoughts people will walk away with, after seeing the violins or hearing, one of these concerts.
So first of all, there is always hope, but we rather not get to the point that we need hope to save us. And there are other ways to solve conflicts. And still, even in today's world, we still see all the atrocities going around there, all over the world, every single continent, many countries, many places. And we have to try and do what we can do to try and help those who need help and make sure that we tell the stories and never forget them.
Yeah, I think it's really a powerful message from the violins is that, certainly this is a history that we should never forget. And I think the violins are a powerful reminder of that history and of the people who played them. But yeah, also that, really what unites us is, our desire to be treated humanely and with respect. And I
Yep.
think the violins are a very powerful reminder of that as we walk into our daily lives. So I'm hoping that someone will ask a question of Avshi or of me.
Yeah, so we do have a couple more minutes for people to enter their questions. I do have two.
Okay.
One is, where are the violins going next? Is there a next stop for the Violins of Tour exhibition somewhere offshore? Are they going back to the workshop?
No, they're going from you, they're going to Reading. And after Reading, they'll go to Los Angeles, then to New York, and then to South Carolina, then to 1 month vacation in Israel, with a small concert, 2 concerts probably in Paris in between, and then back to United States.
Wow. Okay. So how long is this trip for the violins? It sounds like it's going to be.
They cannot go over 1 year annual because we have a special import-export paper that is good only for 12 months. So they go for about 10, 11 months, and then they have to go back to Israel. They can go out the next day, yeah, but they have to come back for at least a few hours.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so we do have another question. What has the reaction been to the shows?
Well, I would say it was good. I mean, I heard only the good parts. I don't know, you need to ask other people, the organizers there, for the bad parts and what they feel about it, because, I mean, in the end, when I went to the concerts and to some of the things, I mean, it was kind of full, which is always a good thing. And I heard very good reactions, but if there were other things that I was not told, I honestly can't say.
Well,
Thank you.
I think the reaction here has been very positive in Richmond. And I should mention that not only are the violins on display here at the museum, but there are also violins on display in an exhibit at the Virginia Holocaust Museum and at the Black History Museum and Cultural Center, here in town. So it's been a really great collaboration, and I think has reached, quite a broad audience of people.
And tied into that, Andy, I think Andy and Avshi, you can both comment on this. We have another question. Is sharing the exhibit among different museums, as in Richmond, unusual?
We had one place in Fort Wayne that we had 2 exhibitions during the same time. And people are going to do that, the same thing, because they realize that you get more audience. I mean, every single violin has a different story, of course. So it's not that I can give you 2 violins from Hackert and 2 Fievel and whatever. But each museum has its own way of looking at things and all these different desires of what to exhibit and how to show it. And I think it's a good way, because then you get many more people rather than having only one museum showing them.
Right. And then Andy, I guess specifically for us at the VMHC, this is not the first partner exhibition that we've done. So I think if you want to speak a little more to what we have planned and what other exhibitions we have that are currently partner exhibitions.
Oh, well, I mean, so I think that, partnering with other institutions is remarkably valuable. We have 8.5 million things in our collection, and one of the most basic ways that we can partner with another organization is to share our collection with them, right? Because just as Avshi said, there are so many violins in the collection, maybe not everyone can display all of them, but if there are multiple institutions, more of those stories get told. And so We have a long-standing partnership with the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia. We currently have an exhibit that we did in partnership with them that features items from their collection. We're working on an exhibition that will open next spring called Our Commonwealth, where we have 10 museum and cultural partners who are all contributing to the effort, and we have reciprocal agreements with them. So it's it's a way that we get to tell more stories. And I think to Avshi's point, anyone can look at a particular object and interpret it in a very different way. And so it's very interesting to see how the museums here in town have interpreted the violins in different contexts. And for us, I mean, I think the goal was to try to marry some Virginia specific stories, with the opportunity to talk about the Holocaust.
Well, thank you so much for answering those questions. I believe that we have no more, and in recognition of time, I did want to say very, very, very hearty thank you to Avshi Weinstein coming in all the way from Turkey for this program. We so appreciate it.
Sure.
And what a powerful and really important exhibition and just program that you and your family are building. And it's so great to hear that they are continuing on and sharing that story throughout the U.S. and throughout the world. As we sign off, it looks like we might have one more question. So as we sign off, just some housekeeping for our members. We do have, as Andy said, the closing concert for the Violins of Hope will take place this coming Sunday, October 24th. There are a few tickets left, and for members, you are able to reserve a ticket that also includes a member-only reception after the concert that will include some remarks from the curatorial staff here and at the Virginia Holocaust Museum. We also have our J. Harvey Wilkinson lecture that is for members only, that is this Wednesday, so that's 2 days from now. There are a few tickets left for that. And our next curator conversation will take place in December on Monday, December 13th, and it's going to be a roundup of our curators' favorite acquisitions from the year. So stay tuned for that. As always, thank you so much for your support as members. We couldn't do what we do without you. We will share the recording of this program with you via email. And we hope you'll get to stop by and see the violins in person before they close sometime this week. So Andy and Avshi, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Andy,
Avshi.
thank you very much. It's a beautiful exhibition you created.
Thank you very much. Thanks for sharing with us.
Take
Pleasure.
care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.